All right, we got a couple of announcements. One is that there's the Build Your Own Business seminar that's going to run December 14th to the 18th. I don't know if you even know about this, but it's I believe it's 3-credit class, and it is 3 credits. It's $999. If you're interested in how to start and manage a business, preparing a business plan, marketing your business, developing a financial plan, determining legal and tax strategies, how to recruit and staff. So anyway, if you're interested in that, earning an extra 3 credits over the break, December 14th through Friday, December 18th, stop by the secretary's office, 215, just right upstairs, and tell her that you're interested in that. Or if you just want to know a little bit more about it, any of the business people, Dr. Paz or whatever, can give you a little more information on that. This is something that is, it's the 9th annual Douglas Rogers Conditions for a Free Society competition. And what it is that there's actually you are supposed to talk about the following passage. You do basically you write an essay, which is the following passage from Ludwig von Mises' Liberalism. And comment on the intellectual origins of that quotation and enduring significance for cultivating the virtues necessary to sustain a free society. Anyway, there's a quote from Liberalism. Some of you had Econ 105. First place is $2,000, second place is $1,000, and third place is $500. So anyway, it is due January 15th. So if you're interested in writing a paper, it doesn't say that it has to be any particular length. It says, basically, prizes are going to be awarded if they're of sufficient quality, and if you consent, they will publish it in the Citizens and Statesmanship, an annual review of political theory and public life. So it says there's no minimum word requirement, but it doesn't say there's a maximum one either. So anyway, if you're interested, send me an email. It's the Center for Political and Economic Thought out of St. Vincent College. Anyway, they sent me this thing, and if you're interested in writing an essay over the weekend or over the break from Mises' Liberalism, then send me an email, and I'll connect you up with the folks that are hosting this competition. All right. I'm a little bit behind in the band pick of the week because I forgot to do it on Monday. And then I'm going to actually give it to you today, but then I'll bring Classic Album of the Week on Monday and give you the band pick of the week for next week on Monday. But anyway, it's a band called Midland. You never know what you're going to find behind here. It's a band called Midland, and they're out of Texas. They're a country band. They started in 2016. Does anybody? Oh, wow. Okay, good. A couple folks have heard them. They have a song called Mr. Lonely that you might want to get on Spotify and take a listen to. So anyway, that's the band pick of the week for this week. Again, a country band out of Texas. All right. Last time, it's hard to see anybody's expressions, but I can tell by your eyes, sort of, that when I was taking a look at some of the problems in the theory that we were going over, I don't know if that was quite getting to you, so we're going to go over that a little bit again. So what can happen is, again, all we're trying to do is say, okay, here's economic theory, here's how the law would look like if it had the most efficient use of resources. In particular, we're talking about tort law. And so what are you trying to do? We're trying to set that the W, which is, remember that your total cost is Wx plus P of x times A, right? Where this is x is the units of precaution. We assume a constant cost of increasing precaution. When you increase precaution, this probability of the accident goes down, and this is the cost of the accident. We're presuming that's a fixed number just to make the algebra work out. And so what are you going to do? You're going to, that's your total expected cost, right? And we're trying to minimize that. So we're saying, okay, what would you do if you were minimizing that? Well, you'd set take the derivative and set it equal to 0, right? And the derivative of Wx is W, because that's a constant. And this was P prime of x times A, which is the first derivative of the probability function. And so we ended up, that's what your minimization of the total cost was, right? So then we looked at, okay, what happens if we do the law this way and do the law that way? And we said, with strict liability, what happens is with strict liability, the potential injurer will set their precaution efficiently, but the potential victim, since it's strict liability, potential victim won't. We said that if you had no liability, the potential injurer has no incentive to use Wx. Because P of x times A is 0. So they're going to where do they most efficiently or minimize the cost to them is when x equals 0. But the potential victim can set their will set their precaution efficiently. Then we said, well, how could you get it to do both? You could have negligence, right? And we had 4 different kinds of negligence. And we said, okay, if you have negligence, then because of this big drop in the cost when you hit the efficient level, if we somehow knew what that efficient level is, then we make the rule that if you're a potential injurer, if you hit the efficient precaution level, then you have no liability. And if you are the potential victim, you know that the potential injurer is going to have this big drop when they hit X star or X, whatever we're going to call it, the efficient level. So you know they're going to do that. So now you know that there's really a no liability issue. So you're going to set the precaution efficiently. And if you are on the other side, if you know that the potential victim, if they hit their level of efficiency, then it's strict liability. So you know that they're going to do strict liability because of the sudden drop. Or they're going to be efficient. So now you know you've got strict liability if you're efficient, if you're a potential injurer. So you'll set your precaution at the efficient level. And so because sort of again from game theory, looking forward and reasoning back, you know that the system's set up for the other party to have efficient precaution, which means you've got all the liability on you, and so you're going to take efficient precaution. So that was just the, okay, that's the economics of the thing. And then we said, well, what happens if you've got when you got problems? What if you've got errors? So I just labeled these difficulties if in applying the theory. So we said, well, what happens if there's consistent errors in the estimating harm? Okay. So the first one was because what I've got to do, right, is I've got to know what A is, right? What if there's consistent errors in estimating what A is? Under if you have strict liability, so remember that was what A is, right? If you have strict liability, if that's the rule, then what ought to happen is the precaution that's taken by the injurer is going to move in the same direction, right? So that if you underestimate, so under strict liability, if you underestimate it, what's going to happen is the injurer or potential injurer will take less precaution than is efficient. And if you overestimate, they'll take more precaution than is the efficient level. So if somehow you knew what the efficient level is, but you get the harm wrong, that is either is you guessing what the harm is going to be, or if the court consistently overestimates the harm, what's going to happen? You're going to take more precaution than is the optimum level. If the courts consistently underestimate the harm, then you're going to reduce the amount of precaution that you have, and so you won't hit the efficient level. Again, what if you have consistent mistakes in figuring out who caused the harm, right? So suppose you have consistent mistakes in who caused the harm. Well, you're going to get the same thing. That is, if I know what the under strict liability, again, if these are consistent, right, they're not random. If you notice there's a consistent error in getting the who caused the harm, then what are you going to get? You're going to get the same thing, right? The injurer is going to take less precaution. Going to take less precaution. If you tend to get it wrong in, you don't figure out they caused the harm, or you underestimate the chances that they caused the harm, and it's going to work the other way, right? If they tend to overestimate who caused the harm, if they tend to overestimate that the injurer actually caused the harm, then what's going to happen? They're going to take more precaution, right? So it's not rocket science here, right? So if I have consistent errors, I don't figure out that you actually caused the harm consistently. You know, if I underestimate that you caused the harm when you really did, then you're going to get caught less, which means that you're going to get you're going to get sued less, one of the two. And so what will happen is you'll take less precaution. If we tend to overestimate on a regular basis, or consistently, we tend to overestimate, then what's going to happen is you're going to take more precaution than is efficient. A third thing is, what if there's small errors and damages, or the harm, what we just were talking about. So under strict liability, we talked about, you're going to go the same direction. But what if there's small errors in damages, and you have negligence as the rule? Well, just think about that for a minute. What happens in negligence? What happens in negligence is when you hit the efficient level, there's a big drop in your cost, right? Because you go from strict liability to no liability. So if there's a small error in the damages, that probably won't affect what you do. It probably won't make it so that you're going to switch from getting to that X star, because if there's a big drop in the damages going from strict liability to no liability, if I miss it by $10 and it's $15,000 you're going to have to pay, then you're going to have, instead of it dropping $15,000, it'll drop let's say it's a $100 miss, it'll go from 15,000 to 14,900 drop, and so you're going to do it anyway. So if you have negligence rule, it's not as important that you get what the damages are. If the errors in damages are random, that is, sometimes they overestimate what the damages are, and sometimes they underestimate what the damages are. Under a negligence rule, it shouldn't affect it, right? It shouldn't affect if you pick the efficient precaution. Because if they're random, then sometimes the A is going to be too big, and sometimes the A is going to be too small. So you don't know if they're going to, if any particular time it's going to be too big or too small. So rather than try, if they're random, then you're going to just pick the efficient precaution. And sometimes when they actually assign the harm, you will have you might have taken more precaution than you needed to. If they overestimate it, you wouldn't have taken enough precaution if you needed to. But basically, the damages on the upside are going to be averaged out by damages on the downside. So random errors in figuring out what A is not going to affect, under a negligence rule, the amount of precaution that people take. If the errors if you have a negligence rule and you have errors in the standard, if negligence rule and you have errors in the standard, then what's going to happen is you're going to cause the increased precaution. If you set the standard too high, right? Because you don't want to be outside the standard, right? Because if you're outside the standard, you get this big jump in what your costs are. So you want to be inside the standard. So if the errors are where they set the standard too high, what's going to happen? Then you're going to increase your precaution. If it's too low, then what will happen is you'll decrease precaution. So basically, what are we saying? We're saying, look, under a negligence rule, it's important that you get the standard right, right? It's not as important that you get the harm right, okay? If you get the harm wrong by a little bit, they're still going to go to the efficient level. If you set the standard wrong, then they're going to move the precaution to match what the errors in the standard are. If the errors in the standard are random, and you have a negligence rule, in the standard are random, and you have negligence, on a negligence rule, if you sort of think about it, you're going to increase precaution. And why? Let's just think for a minute about that. Because you want to be inside the precaution. So if there's errors in the standard of what the precaution is, the cost of increasing the precaution is probably not that high, right? That's the important thing here in just sort of thinking through the logic of that. It doesn't cost a lot to increase precaution. But if you're caught outside the precaution, it's going to be a big problem, right? So if you don't know that they're getting the standard right, what you ought to do is make sure that you're going to be inside the precaution, because it might cost a little more to have more precaution. But if you get if they get it wrong and make it too high, and you took the efficient amount, but they got it wrong, then you got a big increase in your cost, because now all of a sudden it's strict liability. Okay. So again, it's just a matter of sort of thinking through what the incentives are of the injurer under strict precaution and or strict liability and under negligence rules. All right, and then we talked a little bit about administrative costs. We said that if you're totaling up all the costs of tort law, one of them is how the heck do you administer the thing. And we noticed that if you have there's actually I have an article, I don't know if I mentioned it, there's an article on no-fault insurance in the folder. And that as I said, there are 12 states that have no-fault car insurance. And what is the argument for no-fault car insurance? The argument for that is that you've reduced the administrative costs. I don't have to show who caused the accident. So you want to sort of remember that when you're setting this system up, you got to think about you have to think about administrative costs when you're determining what your law ought to look like, right? You have to think about administrative costs. You don't have to hire an attorney and prove anything on no-fault insurance. But if you have strict liability, then if you have strict liability and you have, you're going to also reduce, think about this. If I have strict liability, I'll also reduce administrative costs. All right. So if I have no fault, right, then I don't have to worry about who caused it. So I don't have to go in and I don't have to engage in a suit. If you have strict liability, then you've also reduced administrative costs. You have reduced administrative costs. And that's because I don't have to prove negligence. Right? If I'm suing you under a negligence rule, I got to prove A, that you caused the harm, and B, that you were negligent in what you were doing. If I have strict liability, all I got to do is my attorney's just got to show that you caused the harm. The problem is you can also have more chance to sue, right? So you might have more people suing. And so what will happen is that would increase the administrative costs, right? Because you have more lawsuits involved. So if all I have to do is show strict liability, all I have to do is show you that you caused the harm, then I'm going to think, right, just going back to our basic, I got to figure out what's the expected value of my going out and suing you, right? So if I have to prove negligence, then it's going to be harder than if I just have to prove that. So maybe I got to hire a better attorney. I got to, the court costs are going to be larger. Maybe the probability of my winning the suit is lower. And so I got to figure out what's the cost of my hiring the attorney and what's the expected gain from hiring the attorney. Okay? And if the probability of me proving negligence is harder than me just proving who harmed it, then I'm going to say, okay, maybe I'm not going to go ahead and sue, right? Because I don't know that I can show that you were going 5 miles over the speed limit. I know I can show you crashed into my car, but I don't know that I could show that you were going over the speed limit. So, there's more options to, there are going to be more lawsuits under strict liability than under negligence. All right, so the whole point of that is to get you thinking about, okay, what are we trying to do? We're trying to get everybody to hit their efficient precaution, and under different rules, we have different incentives for you to get there. But then if we note that there's these particular errors, then we'll know, okay, will we get too much precaution, or will it not affect the precaution, or we get too little precaution? And so then you can, when you're making the law, you can think through those things. All right, any questions on that? All right, I think looks like that's a little clearer than it was last time. Yeah?
When you talked about number 6, the errors in the standard are random, and you said that it doesn't cost a lot to increase precaution. Is there ever a case where it costs a lot to increase precaution?
Yes. If it costs a lot to increase the precaution relative to what it's going to cost you if you're outside the standard, right, then that wouldn't hold. But notice that what you've just done is you've figured out when you might want to do this type of law and when you might want to do that type of law, right? If I might have to worry, about under a negligence rule, I might have to worry a lot more about getting the standard, standard right if it's really costly to increase the precaution. If it's not that costly to increase the precaution, hey, what's going to happen? Probably going to end up with not much difference. Okay. What will happen? You will know that injurers, in fact, you'll know that injurers will take more precaution, but what's the social cost of doing that? If the social cost of doing that's really high, like your point, then you say, oop, okay, maybe we got to be a little more careful about that. But if the cost of increasing the precaution isn't very much, then the fact that the injurers are going to increase the precaution is not a big deal. Okay? So again, it's a matter of when you're structuring the law, here's the things to think about, right? Because if I can, I'll know, okay, when are we going to get too much precaution? When are we maybe get too little precaution? Maybe sometimes it doesn't matter, and so that will give you a better idea. And when you're looking at the law, it's a matter of giving you guidance about which direction to go. I mean, that's basically what the whole class talks about, right? It's not like you can get the exact right answer, but it's a matter of how should we structure the law to get to the most efficient spot. Now, if you talk about consumer product injuries, if I have a consumer product injury, so when we're talking about accidents, what we're saying, okay, there's high transactions costs. Like, I can't say to you, oh my gosh, don't swerve into my lane because you're going to cause an accident, right? So there's a transactions cost here. And so, but what would happen if you have accidents that are caused through products where I'm buying the thing, okay? So there's not a high transactions costs here, but there is perhaps a differential in knowledge. You've got asymmetric information here about how the product works, okay? So suppose that there's a strict liability for product failure. Okay? You sell me a chainsaw. Okay? If there's an accident, something goes wrong with a chainsaw, then I'm going to be liable. So what's going to happen? Since there's strict liability, I'm going to take the precaution that is needed, right? So the producer takes the precaution that's needed, and where does that show up? That shows up in the price of the product, right? Maybe I got to make the chainsaw with some better chain, or I have to make the thing that guides the chain better, but it's going to show up in the price of the product. So what's going to happen is the cost of production is going to include the expected accident cost, right? It's going to include because what am I going to do, right? I'm going to increase the precaution until it meets the expected value of the accident, right? That's W is going to be equal to P prime of X times A. So if I'm the producer and there's going to be strict liability, what's going to happen? It's going to show up in the cost of the product, because I'm going to build the product so that the expected cost to me of an accident is equal to the expected cost of making the product safer. All right. So what if you have tires, and you can make tires from synthetic rubber or regular rubber, right? So I can make tires, and I can use synthetic rubber, or I can use regular rubber. And synthetic tires are cheaper to make. But they're more likely to cause an accident. They're more likely to blow up or blow out, right? So they're more likely to blow out and cause an accident. So what happens if the expected accident cost is really high? It could be that the total cost of the synthetic tire could be greater, even though the production cost is less. Okay? So this part, if this is greater than I'm going to say this part, but if we say the expected loss from the accident is high, what can happen? Then what would happen is that you would choose the rubber tire, which is higher total cost, right? And that's because which is not the higher total cost. Just the choose the rubber, it's a higher total. You'll choose the rubber cost because, let's put it this way, because there's a higher total cost from the synthetic. Okay, so the synthetic's cheaper to make, but the expected cost of the accident is higher than the rubber tire, and it's possible that the expected cost of the accident is sufficiently high that you're going to use the rubber tire. Okay? So the rubber tire is going to include what's going to happen. The rubber tire is going to include the expected accident cost in the cost of the tire. Okay? Because that's what you're going to do. If the rubber tires have a lower expected cost, and it's sufficiently lower, the lower expected accident cost. If that is sufficiently lower than the manufacturer cost, what am I going to do? I'm going to pick the one that's got the least total cost to it. So I'm going to choose the rubber tires. So you're going to get the efficient use of the product. Okay, you're going to get the efficient use of the product if you have a if you have the strict liability. But what if you have no liability? Right? What if you have no liability? Well, then what's going to happen is if you have a perfectly informed consumer, right? If you have a perfectly informed consumer and no liability, what will happen? They're going to know that all the liability is on them, and what are they going to do? They're going to pick the same tire, right? Because if the producer got it right, if the producer said, here's the total cost of producing the tires, rubber tires are cheaper to produce because the reduction in the expected loss from an accident, because the reduction in the loss of from the accident is bigger than the increased cost of making the rubber tire, then what I'm going to do? I'm going to make the rubber tire. If the synthetic tires expected loss from accident using synthetic tires isn't very big, and the cost of producing them is much less than the cost of producing a rubber tire, then what will happen? I'll use the synthetic tire. So let's just assume that the rubber tire is the one that you pick because its reduction in the expected accident cost is larger than the increased cost. If you had that's under strict liability, that's what you do, right? Because you got to, if you're the producer, you got to do that. If you have a perfectly informed consumer and you have no liability, doesn't matter, right? Because a perfectly informed consumer is going to know the same thing, right? And they're going to look and say, well, gee, if I buy this rubber tire, I know it costs a little more for the rubber tire, but the chances of me having an accident are much lower, and so the expected loss from the accident is much lower, and it offsets the additional cost of the rubber tire, right? So people probably do that all the time, right? But what if you have, and so it won't matter if you have a perfectly informed consumer, right? You'll get the same result. But what happens if you have an imperfectly informed consumer? And they underestimate. Right? They underestimate P of XA, right? They underestimate what's the probability of an accident. Then what will happen is if you underestimate, then they will choose the tire that is less expensive, right? Which is they're going to choose the synthetic tire. So if they underestimate, then what's going to happen is they're going to choose the tire that has more total cost. If they overestimate, that is, they think that the accident's more likely to happen. You know, there's some sort of ad or something, or their parents have told them, oh my gosh, you really need to have rubber tires, and they don't know because the last time they bought tires, they didn't know really how to make synthetic tires, but now the technology of synthetic tires is much higher than it used to be, or whatever, right? So if they overestimate, then what's going to happen is you're also going to, if you're going to overestimate, then what's going to happen is that you might choose the You might choose the rubber tire when you really should have chose the synthetic tire, right? You might choose the rubber tire over the synthetic when the synthetic was actually had lower total costs, right? So if you don't have a perfectly informed consumer, then it matters whether you have strict liability or whether you have no liability. Under strict liability, the consumer is going to end up paying the full total cost. Yes, you have a question?
Yeah. Is there ever a difference between the producer's total cost and the consumer's total cost? Is there ever a situation where it would cost the producer more if there was an accident than it would cost the...
Well, no, but when we're talking about the total cost, well, what I'm saying here is that when you go to buy the tire under strict liability, what will happen is under strict liability, the producer is going to make the tire that has the least total cost, and that will be embedded in the cost of the tire when you go to buy it. So when you're the consumer, you're going to pay the total cost because the cost of having the proper precaution in the type of tire is going to be embedded in the cost of the tire itself. Now, if you are, so under strict liability, it's going to get set correctly if the producer knows what the heck they're doing, right? If the consumer knows what they're doing, if the consumer is perfectly informed, they're going to know the same thing, right? And we already said that the producer is going to make the tire which has the least total cost under strict liability. So under no liability, you're going to get the same thing if you have a perfectly informed consumer. So it doesn't matter what you do, because the perfectly informed consumer is going to go, oh, I get it. I know that this rubber tire is actually cheaper because I know what P of X times A is, and I know what W is, and so I know, hey, this is the right tire. So if you have a perfectly informed consumer, it doesn't matter which way you're going to do it. But if the consumer doesn't know what the heck's going on, then the consumer, if you have no liability, the consumer is going to go out there and guess, right? And the consumer could pick the tire that has lower total cost because they're underestimating what the actual P of X times A is. And so a uninformed consumer could lead to synthetic tires being produced when the actual total cost is the total cost of society that's now borne by the consumer. They're going to end up with this accident, and they're paying for it. And if they had known what was going on, they wouldn't have bought the synthetic tire. They'd have bought the rubber tire.
Under no liability, wouldn't it be true that the producer determines what kind of tire is produced because they wouldn't want to produce the other kind?
If there was no liability, then what would happen? If there was no liability and you're the producer, if you have perfectly informed consumers, they're not going to want to buy the synthetic tire. You're only going to sell the rubber tires, right? Because they're all perfectly informed. They're going, holy smokes, Bullwinkle. I know that the rubber tire is got the lowest total cost, so I'm not going to buy that synthetic tire. I know it's got, maybe you're charging $10 less for the tire, but I know there's an extra $20 in expected cost, so I'm not going to do that, right? But if the consumer doesn't know what's going on, then you can get it wrong, right? If the consumer doesn't know what's going on, the consumer might buy, if they think there's a bigger chance of an accident with synthetic tires than there really is, what are they going to do? They're going to buy the rubber tire when the synthetic tire was actually cheaper. The total cost was actually cheaper. If they underestimate it, then what would happen is they would buy the synthetic tire when the rubber tire was actually total cost was actually cheaper, right? So when you have an uninformed consumer, then what's going to happen is they may not buy the tire that has the lowest total cost when you include cost of producing it plus the expected accident cost. So what should we do, right? Should have strict liability, right? Because the producer is always going to get it right under strict liability, right? Under no liability, then uninformed consumers can buy tires which are more expensive in total, either because they bought the synthetic and the accident cost is really high, or they bought the rubber when the accident cost is really low. So this would be an argument for strict liability for the producer. Right? So if you have especially if you're producing something like like a chainsaw or something like that, right? If you're producing something where the P of X times A could be high, and the consumer may not be very well informed, then you do strict liability. If it's something where the consumer really ought to know what's going on, then you would have a no liability. You could do negligence, but then what's going to happen? Then you got this administrative costs. I not only have to show that you you caused the accident, the chainsaw caused the accident, but you could have made the chainsaw a little bit better, and it wouldn't have caused the accident, right? So you're going to have an increased administrative cost if you start adding negligence to the strict liability. Again, if you do this, you also have to think through under strict liability. Then you have that the consumer will take less precaution than they might with the chainsaw, right? So you might not have to worry about something with a chainsaw because if they cut their leg off, that's going to be a big cost to them, right? So maybe they can't get themselves back to the indifference curve, right, that they started with. So it's just to give you, again, a method of saying, hey, if we sort of know that consumers don't know what the heck they're doing, then we're going to go with strict liability, right? If the consumers are really informed about this product, then we can do no liability. All right, so basically we've now finished chapter 6. We'll start chapter 7 on Monday.